Well, hello, everyone. Phil here. So, the Tulsa Massacre and Jehovah's Witnesses, is there a connection? Yes, there is. We are going to check it out today. Today is May 31st, 2021. It is the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, which happened in 1921, May 31st. I'll be totally honest, I had never heard of the Tulsa Massacre until this weekend. Thank you, American school system. But yeah, I learned about it on Reddit. Thank you to Reddit user XWitSurvivor, who first mentioned it there. You can also tell that because of this, I am way behind on my pop culture consumption because the Tulsa Massacre was a big plot point, as I understand, in the Watchmen TV series that was aired in the past year or so. So check it out there, I guess. So just for a brief recap of what the Tulsa Massacre was for those like me who are ignorant, on May 30th, 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was this incident between a young black man and a young white woman. It's unclear exactly why, but they ran into each other downtown on Memorial Day there in Tulsa. There was this incident where so she worked as a elevator operator, and he worked as a shoe shiner downtown in Tulsa, and he had to take her elevator up to the only bathroom he was allowed to use as a black person. And so, anyways, there's this incident where she screamed, and he rushed out of the building, and a white store clerk who was there witnessed it, and he assumed that the guy had assaulted her, and he called the police. It doesn't seem like there was any sort of assault. It was more they knew each other, and there's some question of, did they have a romantic relationship, or did he just trip getting into the elevator and grabbed her by accident to keep from falling? So there was no assault or anything. But anyways, so the police got involved, and the next day on May 31st, they arrested this young man as they were during their investigation. And at that point, the police were keeping it pretty low key. You know, they had taken a whole day to detain the fella. But that afternoon, one of the Tulsa newspapers published this really incendiary article about that said, "Whoa, boy, I think there's going to be a lynch mob tonight about this issue." And it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what do you know? A lynch mob formed outside the jail there downtown to lynch this guy. So this big mob of white men formed outside the jail. It started with a few hundred and eventually got up to like 2,000 guys armed. And so they were all there. And the sheriff told them to disperse, and they wouldn't disperse. And then meantime, the black community also was concerned about the potential for a lynch mob. So just to explain, Tulsa was really segregated at that point. It was segregated by city law. So all the black residents lived in one section of the town. But the thing was, it was actually like a really successful part of town. It was kind of modeled on a model that Booker T. Washington had created. And he had created sort of a model town in one spot called Greenwood. And so this was also called, kind of named after that, the Greenwood District. And there were a lot of actually fairly wealthy black business owners that lived in the area, and then all the black residents of Tulsa kind of lived in this one district of the city. And so one thing to keep in mind, so this is 1921, so this is just a few years after World War I ended. So there's a lot of young men in Tulsa, both black men and white men, who were combat veterans. So they were well trained in using guns and trained in combat. And so anyway, so there was like 50 or 75 black men armed that came down to the jail to see if the sheriff needed to like deputize them as deputies to protect this guy in custody. And the sheriff is, no, go home. I got it under control. And he did tell the white mob the same thing, go home. I got it under control, but they didn't leave. But the black men did leave. And so as they were leaving, one of the white mobsters tried to forcibly disarm one of the black men, and a shot went off, and then that started this whole firefight right outside the jail there. And in the end, 10 white men and 2 black men were killed at that time. And that kind of started this whole total anarchy riot in Tulsa for the overnight. And so there were just these rolling firefights of people shooting at each other. And ended up 3 more white men died, and then 24 black men were killed. Hundreds, like 800 people went to the hospital with injuries that night and the next day. And so initially the black residents kind of set up like a defensive perimeter in the black district, but just the numbers were against them, and eventually thousands of black residents fled the city, and then thousands more were kind of herded up at gunpoint and placed in detention centers by the white mobs. And then, so as the black district started to empty out overnight, then the white mob started to set buildings on fire. And so the report, and there's a really good, this is, sorry, this is all from Wikipedia, but it's a pretty good article on the Tulsa Massacre. But it mentions that 191 businesses were burned down, a junior high school, several churches, and a hospital was burned down by the mob. The Red Cross reported that over 1,200 houses were burned, and another 215 were looted but not burned. The Red Cross estimated that 10,000 people were left homeless as a result of this race riot massacre incident. So that was overnight on May 31st, and then June 1st in the morning, the National Guard arrived, which there were some National Guard already in Tulsa, but they mainly evidently were just there. They were focused on protecting the armory because initially the white mob wanted to loot the armory for its guns and ammunition. But more National Guard pulled in. Martial law was declared in the city on June 1st, and that was kind of the end of the Tulsa Massacre. So, how do Jehovah's Witnesses fit into the Tulsa Massacre? Well, so as we mentioned, that night of May 31st into the morning of June 1st, thousands of black people, residents of Tulsa, were rounded up and were kind of placed in one of 3 main detention centers in the city. And one of the places used as a detention center was called the Convention Hall, and that was Tulsa's main convention center downtown. Now, as you look at pictures of, and so we have this one picture that's really notable here of black men being herded at gunpoint into the convention hall there, and notice a very familiar face in the background on the posters on the convention hall there. Yes, it's our old buddy, Joseph Rutherford, the then president of the Watchtower Society of the Bible Students, who would later be renamed Jehovah's Witnesses. And he was the president for about, 20-some years until his death. And isn't it fun, just a side point of looking at this poster, it's not advertising the Bible Students, it's not advertising a certain book or the Watchtower magazine, it is advertising Joseph Rutherford live and in person at the convention hall. So that's just a fun little glimpse into, to some extent, how the Watchtower Society still views the top men that run the religion. But anyways, so Rutherford is showing up in all these pictures about the Tulsa Massacre because he was on this never-ending lecture circuit in the United States and around the world for that matter, and he was scheduled to give a talk in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we have here, this is the May 1st, 1921 Watchtower on page 144, and this shows us Rutherford's lecture schedule at that time period in 1921. You notice that May 30th, he was scheduled to give a talk there in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So that was May 30th, he gave his talk, and that was the day of the incident that led to the riot, the massacre. And presumably he had left Tulsa by the time the actual riots occurred, either leaving that night or the next morning, presumably. And then the riot started happening, late afternoon, early evening of the next day. So I'm assuming he missed, just by hours, he escaped being caught in the Tulsa Massacre itself. And he had gone on to, his next stop was in Wichita, Kansas. Yeah, so Rutherford was doing this lecture tour around the United States, and going to other countries. So we get some more information in the Wichita newspaper. This is the Wichita Eagle, and this was an article published on May 31st, 1921, on page 10. So this would have been the day before he got to Wichita. So this is a fun little article. It says, Judge J.F. Rutherford of New York, who claims he can prove from the Bible that there are millions who survived the war and who are now living, will never die, will speak at the Crawford Theater Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. The judge will assert that perhaps 1/3 of the folk now living in Wichita will never die. Judge Rutherford admits there are many doubting Thomases, but is bold enough to predict that within a few months even, these doubters will be convinced. And then it describes kind of his actual world tour, and even that they're making movies about him. It says, the speaker has just returned from a tour of Europe and the Near East. Throughout Great Britain, tremendous crowds heard his lecture. His journey to Palestine was for the purpose of making a personal investigation of the rebuilding of that country, which he claims is in fulfillment of prophecy. Movies of his travels have been made, which will be used in support of his theory. And then it just adds a little fun personal color there. He was from Missouri, which is just next to Kansas there. It says, Judge Rutherford stands 6 feet in his boots and reminds one of the splendid Ozarks mountain country from which he came. So yeah, they're just talking about that, hey, Rutherford was even going to be a movie star. Now, the interesting thing is that well, I'm sure all the Bible students in each town attended these lectures. Primarily, these lectures were not for existing Bible students. They were to attract new members from the public. So, for example, if you look at the June 1st, 1921 Watchtower, on page 171, it mentions the number of memorial partakers in Tulsa. So remember, this is before the great crowd, so most everyone was a memorial partaker. And there were only 52 partakers in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And yet, for his lecture, he booked the convention hall, which seated more than 4,000 people. So he was expecting a lot of people to come hear this talk. So basically, he had this routine that he would do for each city he went to. And that is that a couple days before each lecture, the society would buy ad space in the local newspaper, and they would usually run a full-page ad in the local newspaper advertising that lecture. And then in the next day or two, Rutherford would arrive in town, he would give his lecture, and then he'd move on to the next city on the lecture circuit. And if possible, the society would try and have the newspaper run a second article following the lecture, which essentially reprised his main points that he had talked about. So let's see how this played out in Tulsa there. And by the way, thank you to XJW subreddit member Divergent for pointing me to a lot of these references. Okay, so remember, Monday, May 30th was going to be Rutherford's lecture in Tulsa. So on Sunday, May 29th, the society purchased almost a full-page ad in the newspaper in Tulsa, the Tulsa Daily World, which would advertise the lecture. And this is just a super fun ad. This is back when they would use almost like editorial cartoons. I love that caricature of Rutherford there. And but yeah, you see the big old title there, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. It says, in a free lecture in the convention hall Monday night, it will be conclusively proven by many biblical prophecies which have been fulfilled during the past 4 years, and from many others still in course of fulfillment, that thousands now living in this city will never die. And so I think that's where the Wichita paper got that quote, that 1/3 of Wichita living in 1921 were going to live forever, according to Rutherford. And then it goes on to talk about some other things. It really gets into Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes books. And later in his life, he really got into spiritualism. And for whatever reason, the Watchtower Society really had a big beef with with Arthur Conan Doyle. And so almost half the page is taken up with arguing his beliefs. And the other fun part is at the bottom there, and it's a quote from Joseph Rutherford. Remember, this is designed by the Watchtower Society. This is designed by the Bible students. It says whatever they want it to say. And so it quotes Rutherford. It says, I want the statement, millions now living will never die, to be taken literally. as it is in the light of recently fulfilled prophecy, a provable biblical proposition. So there is no doubt about it. This is not like a theoretical or a figurative or spiritual fulfillment. This is a literal statement. Millions alive on May 30th, 1921 in Tulsa will never die. Well, not all in Tulsa, but in the country. So then Rutherford gave his lecture on May 30th, and then he took off. And then on May 31st, the day of the actual Tulsa Massacre, the Tulsa Daily World reprises Rutherford's lecture in a second article. And I'm not sure if this was written by the Watchtower Society as well. There's no byline, but it is heavily, like almost half the article is just a direct quote from what Rutherford's talk was. So maybe, but this article is pretty interesting because it explains pretty succinctly the 1925 chronology, because I was even a little fuzzy on this. Like, what exactly was the deal with 1925 again? Why were they so focused on that? And so this article explains that. So let's check that out. It's just a paragraph or two here. I'm sorry, this is a super faded newspaper article. But it says, quote, "Speaking of the year 1925 as a very important date, Judge Rutherford said, 'Millions of people now living on Earth expect to live 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years more. If the restoration begins within that time, then if they die at all, it will be their own fault, because with the beginning of restoration, every man will be offered one fair and impartial trial for life. When the children of Israel entered the land of Canaan in the year 1575 BC, God commanded that they should keep a jubilee every 50th year thereafter for a period of time covering 70 jubilees, or for 3,500 years. During the Jubilee year, every man who had lost property must have it restored to him. The Apostle Paul plainly shows us that the things pertaining to the law of the Jewish people foreshadowed the greater things to happen. This dealing with the Jews foreshadowed the great antitypical Jubilee. God commanded that the type should be repeated every 50 years. Whether the Jews did this or not, it would in no wise affect the time feature. The counting of the type began 1575 BC, and covering a period of 3,500 years must, of necessity, end in 1925, at which time the Great Jubilee, according to all rules of biblical construction, must begin. Therefore, 1925 must mark the beginning of the period of restoration mentioned by the apostle as quoted above. The promises of restoration and lasting life must be fulfilled sometime, otherwise they would not have been recorded in the Bible." Unquote. So yes, that was the basic upshot of Rutherford's lecture that he was giving around the world, including there in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's really interesting. I would like to know whether it was segregated seating in the lecture hall there, because Tulsa at that time was quite segregated, and so I'm curious if any black attendees would have had to sit in the balcony versus the white attendees. We know that the society had some trouble with that. It did have segregated assemblies in the past, and that had resulted in considerable pushback from time to time from black Bible students. And so there's that kind of notorious article in the April 1st, 1914 Watchtower on page 110, where Russell has to write this long article kind of defending the segregation at one of the photodrama of creation showings. But I'm not sure if that was the situation in Tulsa or not. Now, as the ad stated, there was no collections being taken at this lecture. And so you might kind of wonder, well, what exactly was the deal with all these lectures? How was the society making any money on this? How did it work? Normally lecturers either are charging admission for people to come hear them, or they're kind of being hired by a local group to come give a talk to their city. And that's neither of those things were happening here. But basically, the idea is that the money was being made by selling literature to folks who became interested in the Bible students after attending this first free lecture. Kind of like, I don't know, is this a real thing? The drug dealer that gives the guy the first dose of drugs free to get him hooked, and then he's has that income stream afterwards. I don't know if drug dealers really do that. Yeah, so that's kind of the deal here. They would get interested by the free lecture, and then they would start to buy Watchtower literature. And this is kind of explained in the end of the year, the end of 1921, in the December 15th, 1921 Watchtower on page 379, because evidently this is another thing that the society was getting some pushback on from some of the Bible students about, hey, is it really a good idea that people are donating all this money to you and you're buying all these newspaper ads with it? And they explain, yes, that is a good idea, and here's why. So this is under the subheading Newspaper Advertising. It says, at all the public meetings addressed by the president of the society during the past year and by some of the other speakers, announcement has been made by full-page advertisement in the newspapers. Some have thought that this was a useless expenditure of money. But when it is properly understood, it can be seen that it is an economical way of spending money. The advertisement is not merely for the purpose of getting people to come to the meeting, but as a witness. The full-page announcement carries a statement of the truth, which is equivalent to a tract, and thus reaches for each meeting many thousands more than ever go to hear the lecture. And then here's the key point. From these advertisements, a great many orders have been received by the local classes, as well as by the office, for books and other literature. And if you look just across the page there, it does indeed bear that out, because it says the booklet form of the lecture, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. So far, they'd printed up 3,366,000 volumes, and at the end of the paragraph, it says, at the conclusion of each of these meetings, a large number of booklets was sold. So the plan was definitely working. Now, what's really interesting is at the end of 1921, in the very first issue of the Watchtower for 1921, the question is raised of maybe we should use billboards to advertise. And the society explains that no way, Jose, that would be unscriptural. So under the subheading billboard advertising, it says, shall consecrated money be used to advertise the truth by means of signboards, etc.? We answer no, for the following reasons. Signboards and things similar suggest to those who read them a selfish motive in disposing of books as for pecuniary gain. Oh my. The Lord has not blessed such efforts in the past. I'm not sure if they mean they tried using billboards and there was no return on investment, or just that disposing of books for pecuniary gain was a bad idea. So they say no way on the billboards. But toward the end of this little article, they do kind of try and explain why newspaper ads are different. It says, we think the same rule applies to newspaper advertising of the books. Newspaper advertising for public meetings is different, because that is for the purpose of inducing the people to come and hear the message. So hopefully that's all cleared up. Billboards are unscriptural. Newspaper ads are scriptural, but only if they're for meetings, not if they're for books. So there you go. So that, in a nutshell, is how we're seeing Rutherford's face in all these documentaries about the Tulsa Massacre, because he was giving a talk there the night before the massacre. Now, I tried pretty hard to try and find a reaction by Rutherford or by the Watchtower Society in general about what had happened there in Tulsa with these riots, with the massacre, either in the newspaper or in the Watchtower literature. And I really couldn't find where there was any reaction or comment in the literature about what happened anytime immediately thereafter. In fact, in the past 100 years, since that happened, I could only find a single reference to it. And it was in the October 24th, 1923 Golden Age magazine on page 43. And this is what it says. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a town which often figures in American dispatches as a place where mobs are frequent and where regard for the law is at a low ebb. Tulsa was the scene in 1918 of several attacks by officers of the law upon unoffending Bible students. Later, it was the scene of a terrible race riot in which large numbers of innocent Negroes were slain. Now it is in such evil state that the governor of Oklahoma has been forced to suspend the state constitution in Tulsa County and to place the whole county under martial law, with a view to breaking up the mob violence and floggings which in recent years have given Oklahoma, and especially Tulsa, such a bad name. So that's pretty much the only comment I could find about the Tulsa Massacre in Watchtower literature. And obviously they're very sympathetic that it was a really bad thing that happened to the black community there in Tulsa in 1921. Now, interestingly, There was one major reaction from the society at the end of 1921, and that was quite frankly that the society decided to officially start practicing segregation among black and white Bible students in the United States. Now, to what extent we can tie that directly to the Tulsa Massacre, it's unclear, but I think undoubtedly it must have played some role in that decision of the Watchtower Society. So we're going to take a look at this decision. This is back in the December 15th, 1921 Watchtower on page 378. And the same information is basically reprinted word for word in the 1922 yearbook, if you have access to that instead. So this is kind of a yearbook kind of thing about highlights and summary of how the work's gone in different branches and language groups for the past year. And I apologize in advance. Reading this now, a century later, it is fairly offensive. It uses the term colored for the black witnesses. And so it's under the subheading Colored Branch. It says, the work among the colored brethren has been constantly on the increase in the United States in the last year or more. And we have thought that it would grow much more rapidly if the colored friends more particularly would take hold of it. After prayerful consideration and consultation with a number of the colored brethren, a 4-day convention was recently held in New York, at which time it was determined to organize a colored branch of the society. This has been done, and Brother T.E. Banks of Cincinnati has been appointed to the position of secretary for the colored branch. His office will be in Brooklyn and the work conducted from headquarters here. Some of the colored brethren have had the thought that this was a segregation of the colored friends, but this is entirely a wrong idea. There is no segregation about it. While all Christians are one in Christ, each nationality or people should recognize the privilege of serving their own people. It has been found that the organization of the work under various branches has received the greatest blessing of the Lord, and we have no doubt that his blessing will be manifested particularly on the colored work henceforward. A regular pilgrim service, or in other words, the circuit overseer, will be inaugurated. Public meetings will be held, and we call upon our colored brethren to join heartily in the proclamation of the message of the kingdom now being established. The colored friends will find it much more advantageous to organize separate classes and not meet with their white brethren, but devote their energies and services amongst the people of their own color. It will give more opportunity of service for the colored brethren and a wider witness for the truth. And those who are not able to participate in the service should encourage the others by meeting with them. Therefore, we strongly urge the colored brethren in every part of the land to organize separate classes and carry on a separate public witness. All contributions to this work of the society may be sent separately to the colored branch, made payable, of course, to the society. All communications should be addressed as followed: Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, Colored Branch, 124 Columbia Heights, Brooklyn, New York, and the correspondence will be handled by the secretary in charge, Brother Banks, under the supervision of the office here. So yeah, that is one of the more racist things I have read in the Watchtower literature over the years. And this is the dawn of segregation among Jehovah's Witnesses or the Bible students in the U.S. Before that time, they had at least been nominally integrated. I'm not sure to what extent in real life they were integrated, but at least they had paid lip service to mixing together regardless of race and whatnot. But evidently, as Proverbs 4:18 says, the light grows brighter, and the faithful and discreet slave recognized that more correctly, Jehovah's one true organization on earth should really be segregated by race. And so it went. The Tulsa Bible students segregated into a black group of Bible students and the white group. And so, for example, in the July 1st, 1930 Watchtower on page 208, we find that there are now 2 separate groups of Bible students meeting in Tulsa. And so under the listings for service conventions, it mentions each class's or congregation service director's name and address here. And we find that the white service director in Tulsa was Brother O.R. Covey, and the colored service director, the black service director, was James Creedington at that time. They were segregated. Now, in 2020, last year, the Watchtower Society released a video called "A United People in a Divided World," and in this video, they attempted to explain why exactly Jehovah's Witnesses practiced segregation for decades in the United States. Interestingly, it employs almost entirely black witnesses as the kind of talking heads to justify this decision, although the decision, of course, had been made at that time by the basically all-white leadership of the Watchtower Society. And in the opening scroll of this video, it explains that the society had to segregate due to laws that existed at the time. Now, it is true that Jim Crow laws mandating segregation were very common in certain parts of the United States, and they existed for decades. However, what was the deal with 1921? There was really no particular federal law that was passed in 1921 which forced religions to segregate or anything like that. In fact, for example, in 1916, Tulsa had enacted a law which forbade black residents to move into white neighborhoods and vice versa to enforce segregation in the city. And in fact, in the very next year, 1917, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled such laws unconstitutional. So there was no particular drive at that time from the federal government to segregate religions or any other organization. And yet the society made the decision that, hey, we are going to start being segregated in the U.S. Now, one thing the society has made very clear as a reason for practicing segregation for so long was to protect its real estate holdings. It had concerns that if there were kingdom halls where black and white witnesses met together, that the kingdom hall might be vandalized, it might even be destroyed, and the society would suffer property damage losses. And this is one thing that comes across in the life story of governing body member Samuel Hurd. So Sam Hurd, he's really interesting because he is African American and he is a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, the small board of directors which has always run the religion. Now, as you look at the makeup of the current governing body, there's 8 men currently. Only half of them are actually U.S. citizens and the rest are from other countries. So in that sense, it is an international board. But when it comes to race, it's always been a different story. To the best of my knowledge, Sam Hurd is the first and only person of color in 140 years now that has ever been appointed to the board of directors or governing body, which leads the religion. He was appointed in 1999, so about 100 years into the existence of Jehovah's Witnesses. And as we look at his life story, you can see him mention specifically that one concern about integration was that kingdom halls might be damaged.
In those days, there were 2 congregations in Pine Bluff, one white and one colored, or black. We were sent to the colored congregation, which had only about 14 publishers. Coping with segregation and racism. You may be wondering why segregation would be practiced in congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses. And the answer, put simply, is that there was little choice back in those days. There were laws in place to make it illegal for the races to mix, and there was also the very real threat of violence. In many places, the brothers had good reason to fear that if the 2 races met together for worship, their kingdom hall would be destroyed. Such things did happen. If black witnesses preached from door to door in a white neighborhood, they would be arrested and likely beaten up. So in order to get the preaching work done, we obeyed the laws, hoping that things would change for the better.
So that's what Sam Hurd had to say. And then in another 1920 video segment that the society released, it was titled "With Jehovah You Can't Fail," and it featured a black witness named Louise Blanton. And she, too, mentions that although there were kingdom halls that certainly existed in the South, the society would not let black congregations use those kingdom halls.
And in those years, because of the racial issue in the South, there were so many areas in the South where they didn't have kingdom halls that the colored could attend. So if you were free and you would accept an assignment, the society usually sent us to the South. My parents.
And then if we finally go back to that video about segregation, united people in a divided world, there's a African-American witness named Samuel Brown, and he explains that, again, a major concern was damage to real estate.
Some friends would feel, and maybe rightly so at the time, that there would be some violence if we integrated. There probably was some Kingdom Halls damage and things like that as a result.
And so it was that that Jehovah's Witnesses in the U.S. began practicing segregation in 1922, and this continued for the next 30 to 40 years. It's actually pretty hard to pin down when the congregation is exactly integrated. We have this whole 10-minute video about segregation and integration in the U.S., but they are pretty careful to leave out the actual year that the society ended segregation. It was definitely between 1954, which is the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision about schools having to be integrated, and between then and between 1964, which was when the Civil Rights Act was passed in the U.S. And I believe we can piece together that it was around 1964 when the society ended segregation for witnesses. And I'm kind of basing this on a September 1st, 1994 Watchtower on page 23. And this is the life story of a black witness named Willie Brown. And this is what he writes. But in 1964, the United States Congress passed the Civil Rights Act that banned discrimination in public places, including transportation. So there was no longer any legal basis for racial segregation. Therefore, the question was, would our brothers and sisters in all black and all white congregations integrate and show love and affection for one another? Or would pressure from the community and deep-seated feelings from the past cause them to resist integration? It was a challenge to heed the scriptural command, in brotherly love have tender affection for one another, and showing honor to one another take the lead. For as long as anyone could remember, the prevailing view, particularly in the South, had been that blacks were inferior. This view had been deeply ingrained in people's minds by practically every facet of society, including the churches. So it was not easy for some whites to view blacks as equals. Indeed, that was a time of testing for our brotherhood, for both blacks and whites. Happily, on the whole, there was a wonderful response to the integration of our congregations. Centuries of carefully indoctrinated views of racial superiority were not quickly erased, yet when integration was begun, it was received very well by our brothers, most of whom rejoiced to be able to meet together. So yeah, from what Willie Brown writes there, it seems to be that it was after that 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed that the society integrated the congregations in the U.S. But before that, in that period between 1922 and 1964, during all those decades, segregation was a fact of life for Jehovah's Witnesses in the country here. And this is something that Sam Hurd explains in his autobiographical article, and it comes through clearly in the video the Society put out last year about segregation in the organization.
The rule was we were not to meet together. And we couldn't meet, but we could talk to one another and we could visit.
One of our classmates in the 27th class was a black brother, a fellow student, and we became very close friends there. After we left Gilead, we were going to our assignments. We stopped at a convention in Alabama, and the convention was segregated. One race on one side, one race on another. And it was very difficult, painful for us not to be able to closely associate with our dear friend.
The black worked the black and the white worked the white. So we just obeyed the customary law of staying segregated.
Now, as the civil rights movement grew in the 1950s and 60s, social views began to change about Jim Crow laws and segregation, and eventually laws changed as well about these practices. And beginning again with the Brown versus Board of Education, many organizations started to integrate, and that started with the schools. And eventually there came this point where witnesses kind of realized, hey, we're going to be the odd man out if we don't integrate. And so we need to end this practice now.
But the fact is, there was integration going in other places in the schools and things like that, in the universities and colleges. And so it was obvious that if they could do it, then we even more so.
And so how was it possible to achieve integration among Jehovah's Witnesses?
The process of integration was successful because it was under Jehovah's direction.
But wait, didn't Samuel Brown just say a bunch of schools and universities had already done it before Jehovah's Witnesses did?
The fact is, there was integration going in other places in the schools and things like that, in the universities and colleges.
Well, that makes no sense. Making no sense is tight. So, what was the situation among Jehovah's Witnesses regarding race relations after integrating, which again probably happened in 1964? Well, as Willie Brown's life story indicated, some white witnesses were slow to give up racist thinking. And this really comes out clearly too in another life story published in the December 1st, 1974 Watchtower on page 714. This is a really, really interesting, probably one of the most interesting articles I've ever read in the Watchtower. It's a really fascinating story of a young black woman in her 20s that converted to the Witnesses in the early 70s there. She was a really bright child. She was in advanced classes. She went to nursing school. She became a model. She became a recording artist who traveled with Paul Simon, and she appeared on TV programs. And so she had an interest in civil rights to begin with. And then her father was murdered. And then she had, a stronger desire for change. And she ended up joining the Black Panthers. And she got really involved. She ended up traveling to Cuba for training in revolutionary tactics. And then at some point after that, she ran into and eventually converted to Jehovah's Witnesses. It's really sad. The Watchtower actually doesn't even bother to put a name on the article. It just runs it under an anonymous byline. I would love to know more about her. But at any rate, she writes about the attitudes among white witnesses that she discerned in the organization in 1974, so about 10 years after integration. She writes, "Do not get me wrong. I'm not saying that Jehovah's Witnesses are perfect. At times, I detect among certain ones of them leftover attitudes of racial superiority, and I have sometimes seen a certain uncomfortableness of some of them when in close association with persons of another race. But really, what can you expect after centuries of this world's carefully indoctrinated hatred?" So that's what she was encountering in 1974. And then in 1977, the October 8th Awake magazine was published. And this is one of the most horrifying issues I've ever read of Watchtower literature. It is basically an entire issue dedicated to laying out every racist and white supremacist lie that this society could lay its hands on. And it just laid them all out. And for 25 pages. And then in the very last couple of pages of the issue, it mentions that, oh, by the way, these are all wrong and you shouldn't pay attention to them. But I don't know. If you think it's not awful, I would say take that issue, sit down with a black friend of yours and start reading it out loud to them and just see how many pages you can get into before you're just horrified, mortified. Another thing we find is that the society has freely used the N-word in its literature over the years. Now, obviously not in its writing specifically in Watchtower articles, but it has no problem publishing the N-word when using it in quotes or people's autobiographical stories or contributed articles. Even when you look, if you go on Watchtower Library online and you search for the N-word, there are multiple hits. Even in that, there's a fairly limited selection of literature in Watchtower Library. But and the most recent instances are just back in 1994 and 1990. You'll find the N-word published in the literature. So, I mean, what was the society racist? I think it's more complicated than just a simple yes or no answer. I mean, definitely that all or nothing, black or white thinking is a characteristic of high control groups, and things are more nuanced than that. So we can't give a quick answer. I mean, when I think back to when my family joined the Witnesses, this was in the early 80s. And now, caveat, I'm in a white family. I lived in the Northeast. But that being said, I didn't really pick up on overtly racist culture in Jehovah's Witnesses. Black and white witnesses in the congregation seem to be on a pretty equal footing. A black brother seemed to be just as able to be appointed as an elder as a white brother. And I think most witnesses, for the most part, were pretty proud of their racial equality. And they were proud of the fact that they were all brothers. They were all on an equal ground. And I think by and large, the general arc of Watchtower teaching is to view all men as equal, that not one race is not above the other. Now, on the other hand, we need to think when in 1922, the Watchtower explicitly mandated segregation for all its followers in the U.S. for the next 4 decades, and it only stopped that practice when mandated by federal law. I think it's pretty safe to characterize that as racist policy in the religion. In the book Visions of Glory by Barbara Harrison, who was an ex-witness, she had served at Bethel for a number of years. So this was published in 1978, and she wrote about the number of black people accepted into Bethel. She said, "When I was at Bethel headquarters in the 1950s, there were only, as I recall, 2 male black witnesses working there, both at menial tasks. The explanation given for this disproportionately low number of black witnesses was that it might stumble, that is, distress or give a bad impression to, the witnesses' Brooklyn Heights neighbors, who were presumed not to want Negroes in their moneyed midst. In the late 1960s, when not to be overtly racist became chic, the Heights is a liberal neighborhood, the Watchtower Society pragmatically admitted many more blacks to its headquarters staff." So that's an interesting data point. I mean, I think one key point to really remember is that at its core, the Watchtower Society, or the Jehovah's Witness religion, is a sales company. And this was super clear, super explicit before 1990, when all witnesses were buying and selling books and magazines for a price from the society. Now it's more fuzzy with the donation arrangement. And it's almost more of a long con where there's no money required up front, and only later, once you're well enmeshed into the organization, will the society seek this constant flow of donations and money from its members. But yeah, it's selling a product. And like any company in the nation selling something, it walks a line where it wants to be very careful not to offend or drive off any potential customers or buyers of its product. So it will never, ever take any controversial stand if it can help it. And this is really ironic because here it is claiming to be the only organization being led by God himself. It should be at the vanguard of what is right. And yet it will never, ever take the lead on changing society's social problems, whether it's stances on sexual orientation and identity, or racism, or women's rights. The society will always do the most blandest, vanilla thing, the thing calculated to offend the least number of people. That's why male witnesses have to wear a shirt and tie when they're out preaching or at the meetings, why beards are all but forbidden, why women are still required to wear skirts and dresses at the meetings and in service, even in an era now when female presidential candidates and CEOs wear pants. It's all about not offending any potential sales targets if you can help it. A second main point, I think, is that the society just really doesn't care about any issue that doesn't directly impact its bottom line, that is, its ability to move literature and attract converts. So as long as segregation doesn't really impact the organization's ability to grow, it's just not that important of an issue to the society. And this is really spelled out pretty clearly in the internal Watchtower reference work called Correspondence Guidelines. So this is a confidential manual. It's used by Bethel branch offices to answer letters and phone calls from witnesses about real specific questions about Watchtower doctrines and policies. The Correspondence Guidelines were leaked by certain Bethelites about 5 years ago. And so it's really interesting to read what this internal manual has to say on page 96 under the heading Segregation. It says, "But Jehovah's Witnesses do not try to reform the system of things, including its laws and its strong prejudices regarding race, color, or language. Witnesses themselves should practice Christian love with no discrimination. Where the law of the land legislates certain segregation practices, Jehovah's Witnesses do not flout such laws. Also, we take into consideration predominating local sentiments and customs. While not endorsing segregation, Jehovah's Witnesses keep foremost in mind the commission to preach the good news, not making a big issue of segregation or integration any more than Christians in the first century made an issue of slavery. We realize that only God's kingdom can bring true oneness and equality to mankind. However, even now, Jehovah's Witnesses have made significant strides in overcoming prejudice and racial pride. Now, first of all, I just have to say it seems a little disingenuous to say that Jehovah's Witnesses don't try to reform this world's laws. I mean, witnesses have filed literally hundreds of court cases over the decades, with dozens taking them all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court or the European Court of Human Rights in order to try and overturn laws that the society disagrees with. But as it says, whether witnesses are segregated or integrated is just not that big of a deal to the society as long as it doesn't impact its ability to attract converts. And I guess it's this policy of passivity, of inaction, that is just, it's so sad or frustrating for so many witnesses of color today. It's been really obvious in the past year or two when, for a black witness even to post something on social media about Black Lives Matter, that is to invite counsel from the elders about, hey, brother, you really need to remain neutral or being separate from the world. You don't want to go down that road. And yet, the society has no problem riding on the coattails of the efforts of the civil rights movement. In the 50s and 60s, it just sat on the sidelines doing nothing and even criticizing those who got involved. Glaring example is in the November 8th, 1963 Awake, pages 8 through 11. This was an article the Society wrote which reviewed the March on Washington, which was a massive march in 1963 where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. It describes the march as, quote, a strange mixture of religion, politics, and Hollywood, unquote. And the final subheading, Not All Marched, gives four main reasons why no good black witness, or white witness for that matter, would get involved in the civil rights movement. And yet, if you go on Watchtower Library now and you search subjects like racial prejudice, you're going to get numerous hits of the Watchtower Society praising itself for its lack of segregation, its racial equality, even though that only exists due to federal laws that were passed which mandated it among all organizations, including Jehovah's Witnesses. Barbara Harrison writes another interesting quote in her book. She says, "It can't be underestimated, the appeal of this community. The appeal and the need to belong are so great, it makes it impossible for black witnesses to question the monolithically white nature of their leadership. It allows them to defend the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses were among the last of all religious groups to be integrated in the South. They waited until integration became law. They did not question the segregation laws that had kept them apart until then, nor did they protest them in the name of God. When nuns and priests and ministers and students marched to protest against what the Watchtower Society believed was Caesar's business, the society called them crazed mobs," unquote. And that, it's really something that comes through in that video about segregation from 2020. We definitely see this idea of black witnesses being used to defend the segregation practices and the passivity of the JW religion that the white leaders dreamed up and implemented.
When there was a march or any tension, when we were serving there in Alabama, we wouldn't go to the town on Saturday afternoon to do street witnessing, because if there was a rally or something going on, we would just stay in the neighborhood.
A lot of what they used to call back then freedom riders, people getting on buses going south and people coming in to register voters. The fact is, some of the civil rights organizations were set up in Mississippi and going pretty strong. So as a result, they would think that because we were active and going door to door, we could just incorporate civil rights issues and things like that into our work.
So we got this talk show on the television. The circuit overseer and I went, also a Catholic priest and an Episcopal minister. So the Episcopal minister, young minister, asked what were we doing about the marching. So I told him that we weren't doing anything about the marching. Well, that showed a contrast. I'm black and he's white. They weren't stopping their marching to help us preach the good news of the kingdom, so we weren't going to stop preaching the good news of the kingdom to help them march.
I think a good way to kind of summarize the nuance and the not simple nature of this issue in the Jehovah's Witness religion is what James Penton wrote in his book Apocalypse Delayed about racial issues in the witnesses. So this is the third edition on page 378. He writes, also, witness segregation practiced in the United States until the late 1950s and in South Africa up until the end of apartheid must be put into perspective. True, Jehovah's Witnesses have sanctioned segregation wherever it is legal or socially sanctioned, but this is not because they have approved of it or, in general, wanted it. Rather, they have looked on it as a temporary evil to be ignored in order to preach the gospel of Christ's kingdom. Like the Apostle Paul, who recognized and accepted the institution of Roman slavery, the witnesses argue that in order to carry on their primary work of preaching the good news, they must not get embroiled in civil rights political questions. For if the present world is ending and a new, completely integrated world is near at hand, why should they worry about those evils of segregation, which really do not affect their worship? I think that's just a good summary of how the Watchtower Society has had and continues to have a very complicated relationship with racial issues among its members. And I think today is just a really good day to think about those issues a little bit here on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. Well, that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys take care. We'll catch you in the next video.